So today we're going to be going a little bit more in depth on some genre-specific techniques, and what I mean by that is from our first meeting we were kind of a little bit more focused on beginner techniques, like what do you do when you get a bunch of stems and start a session. This one's going to be like, okay, now that you're in the thick of it in a specific genre, what do you do? So to start that, I'm going to switch over here. Make sure you make your camera the speaker view so you can get this in full quality. And then I'm going to pin myself. Cool. All right. Everybody see this pretty good? Cool. All right. So this, just for some context, this is my song that I put out a couple months ago. I just thought about using this one just because it's easy and we won't get copyright issues because of it. So I'm just gonna use this one. Yeah. So just for context, we're just gonna, for those of you that haven't heard it, we're just gonna listen the whole way through just so we know what we're working with, and then we'll break it down in between different sections. So make sure you have a decent pair of headphones on if you're listening. Laptop changes on speakers aren't going to be that noticeable. And yeah, I think that's it. Cool. Make sure if you haven't, turn on original audio too, which is a little button that should be up in the top left-hand corner. If it's not, you have to go into your settings to enable it so you can enable stereo audio. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's just Zoom. If not, it should be fine in mono because your mixes should sound good in mono too. But yeah, anyway, cool. I think we'll just give it a listen through. Cool. Cool. I also haven't touched this in a hot minute, so this is refreshing to hear it again after so long. But yeah, anyway, so just a couple more context things. There's a lot in this project. Just specifically because of its genre, like mainly in metal projects like this, you get oodles and oodles and oodles of stuff going on. Like I think in this one I have over 100 tracks going on. And that's counting buses and stuff like that. So you're already working with a lot. You already have a lot of condensed layers. And that's kind of the thing of, again, the genre is like just this massive wall of sound coming at you is adding to the impact of things. So what I wanted to start with in terms of some genre specific things, I'll just work down the line of instruments. So I'm going to ignore my main buses for now. We can come back to those a little bit later. I'm just going to go through separate instrument buses kind of one at a time and just kind of talk through what I do specifically in this genre. So for drums, if we listen to the drums, let me find a good section. It's like something with a lot of blast beats and stuff like that. You have your own challenges because the blast beats can very easily like build up and cause a lot of frequency buildups because it's just the snare and like the kick and some cymbals going constantly. So the cymbals kind of layer on top of each other. And little sneaky thing that isn't sneaky but is, these drums are all MIDI. They're all MIDI drums. There's not a single real drum in this thing, which I would have done real drums if I not thought about it a little bit more, if I put a little bit more prep into it, but just with, yeah, fake drums all day. But just with like timing of everything and just how stuff worked, it was just easier just to do this because at the time I hadn't written anything and I didn't want something else to stop my creative flow. So I just kind of just let it keep going. And I viewed it kind of as a hindrance at the time, which if I spent a little bit more time doing it, I would have done it myself. But again, I will make that excuse of not having enough time. But anyway, so, but using MIDI drums is it's not unusual. I mean, some people look down on it, but it's not unusual, but it presents its own problems and solutions sometimes because the whole thing using MIDI drums is like, I have two different kicks going, and they're both triggered, but there's no bleed. Like the one thing with MIDI drums you don't have to worry about is you can program it a certain way so that there's no bleed at all. So immediately a problem is gone, like even on the snare. You don't have to worry about any bleed whatsoever. So gates are immediately out of the question. That's something you don't have to worry about. Another thing is you get the same control if you record an actual drum set, but you get a little bit more refinement over the sound. Like you can actually choose what samples you want to use. And you get kind of full control over those samples themselves. And just kind of how you want them to sound from the beginning. So it's a little bit extra control and a little bit less variability and a less chance of human error. But it's up to preference for the most part. So working through it one at a time. So I have my main drum bus up here, which is routing everything. So I have to play the whole kit. So the whole kit is routing through this bus. So everything's going through here. So besides separate EQs on different tracks and whatnot, I just have a basic, this is a Shep's Omni channel from Waves. So it's doing a couple different things. I've got some saturation going, some compression EQ, all the usual, and then just a little dip, I think, up here. I guess I had a harsh frequency. I don't actually remember what I did when I did this. But going through some genre-specific things, one thing that's really different in this genre is some more in-depth automation. Now, this kind of transpires through different genres, and I definitely didn't do the most in-depth automation I could have. I've learned a lot about automation since I've done this song, so my skill, at least in automation techniques, has definitely improved. But at least when I did this, I emphasized different things. Like, for example, if I look at all the tracks here, like when the blast beats come up, I would boost it because I would lose the top end of the kick. So if I go through here the kick kind of gets a little bit quieter when you go through blast beats. So you're kind of essentially reintroducing a new dynamic level than you were before. So whereas like with an acoustic kit and other things like that, you're kind of given the dynamics from the start, but with automation, you're able to kind of insert your own dynamics. And then if I break down each sample, you have like kind of a dry kick going on. Then I have another trigger. It's a little slappier, add some high-end content, and then a little bit of sub end. And then I do have a sub, which is just, I think it's just a 50 hertz-ish tone. 70 hertz. It's just a 70 hertz tone. And this kick sits higher than most of my other kicks. Usually I like to keep a kick down at like 50 hertz, but when I did this, the kick that was in these MIDI samples, this one, had a resonant frequency sitting up a little bit higher in the mix, so I wanted to at least have the subtone somewhat closer to that. But with the sub, like, the problem with blast beats, especially on the bass drum, is that what I was talking about with that frequency buildup earlier, there's, especially in the low end, there's a huge frequency buildup. So usually whenever you're doing blast beats, you usually try and reduce the sub harmonic content to some quality. So like if I take this in and out, you just get a buildup and you immediately know that there's a sine wave there. But if I take it out, you really don't hear that much of a difference because you're not getting that buildup anymore. And then I just pulled it out different sections throughout the song. This one was a little bit slower, so I left it in. Yeah, like usually under like 100 and stuff like that, you can usually kind of get away with it because it's not going to build up as frequently as it would plus 100 BPM. And then, and also please, if I go a little fast, please stop me. And then the only other thing I'm doing is I'm just doing some compression on the whole sum. So I think I'm doing some EQ. Yeah, so I have some EQ, a little bit of compression on each of the samples, because the problem with samples is it'll sound like a computer because it is a computer playing the samples. So in order to make it sound a little bit more realistic and a little less fake, for lack of a better term, is to give it a little bit of compression, because now you're adding that like flow value to it, and it's now moving a little bit at certain parts versus before where it wasn't. So, and I'm just doing some basic EQ moves. If I take, which one did I do? This one. If I just take this in and out. Like just cutting some mid-range, just making it a little bit more top and low end focused. And then just boosting a harmonic of the kick. I had a lot of problems with upper harmonics. Like if you play something on your phone and you don't hear like a kick as well because your phone doesn't have a sub to it, that's kind of what that helps with, is boosting a octave above or somewhere in the range of an octave above, because your phone speakers can actually produce that. It doesn't really make too much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it makes it more flexible on multiple listening devices. And then the only other thing I did on this was just bus compressor on the kick sum, just to like, the term is to glue. So just to glue all these samples together a little bit more and make it sound like one cohesive kick, is you'll put a little bit of compression on the bus that it's going to, and then that essentially will bring everything kind of together on the same dynamic playing field. And then the other thing I did with the kick was, well, for one, I'm sending it to a parallel drum bus, which, does anybody know what a parallel drum bus is? I'm going to ask.
No.
Thank you, Michael. So a parallel drum bus.
I mean, I feel like I kind of do, but I'll let you explain it.
I just loved how astute that answer was. No. So anyway, so a parallel drum bus is basic. Going back to the word parallel, is you're doing two types of processing at once. So like, for example, I have my parallel bus is running in parallel with my regular tracks. So like if I solo this track and mute this parallel drum bus, you're not going to hear anything change. But if I unmute it, it's really subtle, but what's happening is I'm doing parallel processing right next to the original track itself. So like right now I'm sending the whole kick bus to a parallel bus, and this parallel bus is doing a couple things. I'm adding some extra saturation. I'm super compressing. I should have compressed this. Yeah, like I'm overly compressing it and then just taming it a little bit. Like if I solo just the parallel. I'm also sending the snare and toms to this. Like, hear how almost like distorted it is? What I'm trying to do is reduce, at least in this context, what I'm trying to do is reduce the amount of dynamic content in the tracks and trying to just make them all super consistent. So then when I blend it in with the dry signal, what it's going to do is it's going to beefing it up a little bit. So like if I just solo the kick again, and then just take it in and out. It's really subtle, but listen to the release when I mute the bus. The release gets a little bit long. The whole sound gets a little bit chunkier, but the easiest way to hear it is to listen to the release, because the release of the, well, all the snare, toms, and kick, all that I'm sending to it gets a little bit thicker and a little bit longer. So what it does in the context of the mix is it helps it cut through the mix a little bit better. So if I take into the whole mix, and I mute this parallel bus in and out, it's really, really subtle, but like the key, mainly, I hear it mainly in the snare. And if I would have done this now, I would have done it a little bit differently, because even over such a short period of time, my methods of doing this have already changed. But I really hear it in the snare, like this, you kind of lose the snare in the context. Again, really subtle, but like just as that's the kind of the thing of the genre, is like all these little things kind of come together and make a bigger impact in the end than you think they would, because in the end, when you come to like mastering, and I forgot I mastered this in a different project, when you come to mastering, you're really squashing the dynamic range of everything. So you're trying to make this as translatable as possible as when you get to mastering. But yeah, I think that's the gist of the kick. I might actually, you know what, let's redo, I'm going to redo the parallel the way I would do it now. So I'm going to remove everything. So we'll just the parallel. And then this one plugin I like to use for parallels now. I've jumped around to different plugins, and this one's, I really like this one. This is Supercharger from Native Instruments. If you get the, what's it called? The Native Instruments installer, this version of Supercharger. There's a more complex version of it, but this version itself comes free with the Native Instruments install. But the way I would do it now is I usually overcompress a good bit, still at like negative 16 dB reduction. And then this punch knob is really cool. It's just like a little bit more low end and like accentuates the transients just a little bit. And then this dirt adds, the dirt button essentially adds some saturation. It is a little extreme, but that's kind of the point of a parallel bus, is you're doing one extreme and combining it with what's already there. So if I unsolo this, bring this the whole way down, and then slowly bring it in. So I'm gonna move my camera up so you guys can see what I'm doing. section that didn't play any drums. But I think this method is even more obvious, which, to be fair, I was kind of doing a little bit more than my older method, but that's kind of why I like it, is just because it's so extreme that way. Like everything just kind of ducks behind the layer of guitars and everything else that's going on. But yeah, I think that's just the only other thing I might do is I might just add a quick little EQ just to, because sometimes when you're doing that much, sometimes the low end kind of builds up a little bit. So I'm just going to roll off just a tad. Just make sure it's not too crazy. All right. And then the only other thing I'm doing with the kick is I'm sending it to the bass track. And this is another, this isn't exactly like metal or rock genre specific, but it's used a lot more in this genre. And I feel like most genres tend to employ it. So what's happening when I'm sending it is, which track am I doing it on? This one. So again, this is also still a different way than I'd usually do it. So what's happening is whenever the kick hits, it's altering this band. Whenever the kick hits, it pulls the bass low end down by pre-designated amount. So whenever the kick hits, the bass kind of moves out of the way so the kick impact can come through. So all that movement is triggered by the kick. And again, the way I would do it now, which I'm actually going to redo it the way I would do it now. So I'm going to take this. Usually, so what I was doing in the last one was I was doing just a band. I was doing just really skinny. I would find where that fundamental is, which in this case was that subtone at around 70-ish hertz. But what I would do now, since the kick is not specifically just 70 hertz, there's a lot more frequencies involved than just that. What I would do is I would set it as a shelf and then turn on this threshold function. Turn on the sidechain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the attack and the release, because the kick is a lot faster than the bass is, and I don't want this to be super noticeable. So I'm going to leave this at like 1 millisecond and then drop the release to like maybe like 80 milliseconds, because I want it to duck back out really quickly, because if I have it going on for too long, you're going to notice that the bass is being ducked, and it's just going to not sound as clear. Okay, cool. And then I don't want it to touch too much on the blast beats, because if you are sending something through a movable filter like this and it's hitting blast beats, you're just going to hear it ducking in and out. You're going to hear kind of like a flutter effect. So if I solo this band specifically, you can kind of hear how the low end cuts. Again, it's really subtle because of how quick it is. But what it's doing is just for that brief second is ducking out of the way so it's not taking up the low end space, so the kick has somewhere to be. Because otherwise, the bass is pretty much dominating the low end. There's no other way around it. It's just the low end is being fully dominated by the kick, or the bass. There's no place for the kick to be. Because the bass is more of a, it's not a full frequency instrument, but it's a lot larger than the kick is in most respects. So I'm going to unsolo this. And then I was doing a mid cut before, but playing into that idea of what I was talking about with the kick earlier, about how you want some upper octave resonance for like smaller speakers and stuff like that. I'm not going to make that same cut. Honestly, I don't know why I did it in the first place. And then jumping more on the bass, just did some processing, just some EQs. So if I solo the bass, I was really happy with the tone I got for this, really gritty. So like accentuating some mid-range, like around 1.5, and then a little bit more brightness. And then the other thing I'm doing is I'm using a multiband, what's called a multiband compressor. So what's happening here is it's reducing the amount of low-end content. It's bringing everything down to the same level because low-end is not extremely consistent as it is. It's not super consistent. It's kind of all over the place. Like some notes, like if you listen to something in your car and you hear how a note kind of resonates more, or if like somebody's playing bass in a room and like a certain note just like really rumbles in the room and the rest of the notes kind of just fall flat, you don't really hear anything or feel anything, I should say. That's kind of what this is doing. This is evening out all the low end content. So if I solo just this band, you kind of hear the same thing as the kick ducking, but what you're hearing is now fully evened out versus if I just took this out. What happens is on those higher hits, you kind of lose it a little bit. Let me go find the section where, up here. Yeah, these higher notes. If I turn this off and play that section again, you kind of lose the low end for those higher notes because they don't have as much low end, obviously, as the resonant notes. But now this way you're kind of bringing everything back to where it was. Then I'm actually going to load one of my presets. Again, because I've done this a lot differently over the course of time compared to the way I do it now. Then I am just going to do a slight one. As you saw on the other preset, I did have a slight one up here. And that's just kind of control that dangle and string noise that's going on. I'm going to make sure the attack is pretty tight because I want it to catch most of that. Yeah, this is the way I like to do a little bit more now, where it's less dynamic and a lot more flatlined. Because low end, especially in like a genre with this many tracks, it's really easy to kind of lose control of your low end and just kind of have it just like spiral out of control everywhere. So I like to really keep it tamed, which sometimes is a little aggressive, but I can change that aggressive amount with this knob down here, that my threshold, which affects how much I'm actually affecting of the signal. So I might actually pull it off just a little bit until it starts moving just a tad right now. Yeah, like right there is fine. And then kind of what we talked about in the mixing sessions, 2-3 weeks ago, something like that. I'm still splitting my bass tone like I did before. So now, so it's the same DI, just tripled multiple times. So I have multiple versions performing different tasks. So instead of trying to get a lot out of just one DI, I'm using multiple to kind of fill in those spots. So like here I have my high DI, which is, if I can open that. So what I'm doing is I'm rolling off most of the low end content and making this, sending this through some like distortion because I'm trying to accentuate all the string noise. Like it's a little bit of the distortion, but it's mainly all string dangle. And this is kind of where you get your attack from the bass, is kind of in the string noise. And then we take to our low, which is the opposite. So instead of rolling off the high end, I'm now rolling off instead of rolling off the low end, now I'm rolling off the high end. And now this is just, I have a channel where it's just all sub. So if I need more low end on the bass, I just raise this track. Which in context of the mix, it was actually kind of a little bit much, so I might pull a bit out. But yeah, if I need more low end, I have a fully clean, it's not distorted or anything, because with low end, if you distort low end, it just gets really nasty and it's not as clean as you usually would hear it. But with these separate tracks, I can mess with them as much as I want while still having a clean, consistent low end. And then my last track here is kind of like an overall just like dirty fuzz tone. Like it's kind of, what's the word I would use? Like it's kind of just like messed up in all respects. Like there isn't a lot of clarity. The low end isn't really consistent. It's just kind of all over the place. It's kind of like a trash tone, but it's what provides context. So what I'm using is the STL Tonality Will Putney pack. He's a really good metal producer from Jersey. But what I'm doing, I think I just modified one of his presets. But yeah, what I'm using in context for is multiple tracks coming together to create one whole signal. So I already have my clean high end with string noise and attack, and I already have my clean low end with all the rumble and sub fill that I need. So now this one, I can use this as the actual tone for the bass, and this is what you'll hear. It's not what you'll feel, but it's what you'll hear, and that's kind of the important part. And this one I can get a little bit more creative with, is what I would describe it as. And then all three together. So I'm getting all the clarity and all the mess all at the same time. Which if I did this normally with one DI, there's no way I'd be able to get all of this at once. It's just impossible. And then the only other thing I'm doing with the bass is I actually have two tones. So for the ending breakdown, where it slows down and drops a couple dB, I actually change the entire bass tone changes. If I solo the bass bus and then switch between the two tones. I'm also switching tunings. It's almost the same tone, and I think for the most part it is pretty much copy-paste the same tone. The only thing I did change was I did change tuning. So this normal bass is in drop G, and then I go down a whole step to drop F for the breakdown bit. So I'm processing it differently because now I'm on a new tone set. I'm on a new fundamental, so I'm treating it different because it is different. Whereas like before, this drop G bass was a lot tighter. Everything was a lot more together with the guitars. This is kind of just like free form, just like smack it, everything just going nuts. So I'm actually with the low end, like you can really hear it in the low end. Everything's just full sustain, full fuzz. I think I'm doing the same thing on most of these tracks, yeah. And a little bit upper harmonic boost. But yeah, oh, there's all the effects coming back. But yeah, I think that's the gist with the bass. Any other questions on bass before I jump to guitars real quick? And I can circle back if anybody needs me to anything I skipped, because I know I did skip like half the drums, but kind of with the MIDI thing. But all right, cool. Nobody has any questions. I'm gonna hop next to the guitars. So for guitars, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot going on with everything, but there's a lot. So I'll start with the rhythms first. I'll kind of work my way outwards. So I'm going to start with just the regular rhythm tone. Back to the beginning. So with the guitar, especially the rhythm, I'm doing the same thing as the bass, where I actually have 3 totally different tones going on to accentuate different parts of the song. So the way I have it is I have a main rhythm tone. And then I have what's called a scratchy rhythm, which is kind of like less low end, kind of accentuating like the high end, the pick attack, kind of what we did with the bass, where we're doing mostly some high end scratch and like a little bit of fuzz. It's like kind of like the T100 speaker sound almost. like a very different sound. And then what I'm doing for the last one is beefy rhythms. So like I'm using this tone only on like palm mutes and stuff like that, stuff with a little bit more low end content usually, and then using this extra tone to kind of accentuate that. So if I go through the main riff, so all that's doing is just accentuating palm mutes, like you can hear. So like if I go here with the beefy and scratchy, the low end and the high end tone, in essentially, not exactly, but essentially, if I go here with these two tones, you can kind of hear them off balancing each other on the part that the rhythm guitar is playing entirely throughout the whole song. So it's jumping back and forth between tones just based on the part, because if we go back to the regular rhythm, we're going back and forth between palm mutes and then regular, like just strumming a chord or something like that. And then verses, it's kind of the same thing over here, back when I'm strumming individual notes. So I'm going kind of from one extreme to the other. I'm going from the palm mutes straight to notes. So I'm using these tones to accentuate each other. So if I put this in the whole mix and I take these extra two tones out, you'll kind of hear the guitar kind of disappear for a second. Especially in the chorus, you kind of really lose it a good bit. And that's kind of the thing with, again, this like you're trying to set up this sense that there's this huge wall of sound happening. And using these also kind of in itself increases like your stereo width, because you have your regular rhythm. But then if you throw something else in the mix that is equally spread in the same stereo space, you kind of feel like the stereo spread is wider than it actually is, without having to do any extra panning or anything. You're just adding a different layer. So if I take this in this, at least the scratchy rhythm in and out, you'll kind of hear the stereo spread kind of increase. If you can hear stereo on Zoom, which RIP, but. Especially when there's breaks too, you really notice that it's kind of more stereo when there's breaks, because you're not hearing anything for a second, and then suddenly something like on the very edges of your headphones tickles your ears. It's really interesting. I kind of like how stuff like that fits. And at this point in time, I wasn't really, I wasn't really as fluent in this tone shaping. Like if I did this now, I would probably use my amp in my room here to record everything, but at this point I didn't have any pedals or anything, so digital was kind of the way to go for most of this. But I like how all of these tones just kind of like fit together and kind of create little things just by existing, like without having to do any extra work to it. And then on the bus itself, I'm not really doing too much. I just have a bit of saturation right before it comes in, just to like build up the tension, and then as we hit the entrance, it releases and the saturation turns off. And then kind of similar to what I'm doing with the bass, I do have a low end filter for those palm mutes, because what happens similar to the bass is you'll have a low end buildup during the palm mutes, just like this specific kind of low mids bass frequency will build up. And what I'm trying to do is kind of quell that a little bit. So as you can see, whenever it's cutting a little bit during the regular notes, but it's really cutting during the palm mutes. Like if I take that out, the guitars kind of get a little bit muddier, and it's not as clean. There's not as much definition between switching between the palm mutes and the notes. Not to like, it almost kind of sounds like a bass if it's not on, just with all that build up. And also you have to keep that in mind, especially if the guitar is like tuned really low. Like I said, this is in drop G. So this is already, the resonant note is around like 50-ish hertz. So if you're palm muting and playing the resonant note G, you're already hitting 50 hertz. So you're pretty much in the bass frequency range. So you have to keep that in mind when you're trying to quell the low end for this. You have to think of it differently versus a guitar that's in standard. And especially in this genre where there's a lot of tuning differences between bands, you really have to keep that in consideration. And then the only other thing is kind of similar to the bass. I have a completely different tone for the breakdown because most of this song is pretty tight, knit, it's very rhythmic, and then the end is kind of just like, let's just play stuff and let it sustain and just see what happens. So my tone originally here kind of switches to more of a fuzz, just like overall dirtier tone. I'm not really worried about cleanliness. I'm just trying to get that like sense of just like thickness, for lack of a better word. That's pretty much what it is, thickness. So if we do the transition between the two parts. So just like full fuzz, full sustain, just trying to accentuate those hits as long as possible because I'm not really strumming a lot. I'm just trying to make it fill out the space as much as possible. So if I take, and then the only thing I'm doing on most of these channels is just some filtering, really. Like even on this one, I might pull this back. Some of my filters at first were a little bit extreme. I have another low end pool, but this time I have the range set a little bit lower compared to this one. The range is set a little bit wider because now I'm a whole half step lower, or whole step lower. So now I have to account for my tone center dropping a little bit. And then same as before, I have a regular tone. And then I have that same beef tone, as I said before, underneath. Where it's just kind of a lot of sub, which like for a guitar is a little unusual, but when blending it together with the original tone makes a huge difference in the whole spectrum of things. So if I play this ending breakdown and take just the beef guitar in and out, let me unsolo this. The whole clarity of the guitar kind of disappears. It's that whole thing of just like layering. That's kind of the genre, is just layering for days. Everything's layered in a ridiculous amount. But yeah, I think that's the gist for rhythm guitars. And then lead, I'll do alts first because leads are a little bit more intense. So what I mean by alt guitars is like alternative guitars, like different things that don't really kind of fit a genre of guitar. They're just kind of like effects and stuff. So like at the beginning, I have like a combination of feedbacks and just like general note builds. Like that's just all feedback right before the intro, just to like build, just that little bit to build some tension. Like I have another one over here before the breakdown. Just a little bit, little things like that. Even if you don't exactly hear them, you feel that. And that's kind of what I was doing at different points of this song, was trying to add some tension. And then the only other thing I have up here is a harmony part, I will say in very big quotes, and I say that in quotes because harmony is, it technically is a harmony of the note that was played on the regular rhythm. It's just pitch shifted. Oh, I'm doing a pick scrape. Never mind. So here I'm actually doing a pick scrape, which is when you take on the strings and you pick backwards. So you pick from the highest string to the lowest string but you're fretting it in a way that you're playing harmonics. It's just a harmonic scrape is what it's called. So I'm just going up the strings and fretting the harmonics across all the strings. And then here, I think is the pitch. Yeah. So here, I'm actually doing the pitch shift that you hear. It's the regular rhythm. So if I take this rhythm, the rhythm stops, and then it's the chord I would have played just pitch shifted up, I think 2 octaves. Just to kind of like give some contrast and a little bit of like a panic sense. And then I think I have another pick scrape over here. Yeah, just one more pick scrape right before the little brief break here. But yeah, that's not too much for all guitars for this one. I've seen some where like you really get a little crazy, but this one's just kind of more effects than actual guitar parts, if I had to describe it. And then hopping up to leads real quick. There's a lot of leads going on. So these kind of fall into the same thing as the alt guitars, like where there actually are some leads. So like up here at the top, I have the intro. Or just a lot of delay, reverb, just kind of adding some ambience before everything kind of gets dry and kicks back in. And then the chorus, I have another lead. This is more of a lead part as well. Just kind of trying to fill out the back end of the mix because the guitar and bass part in this section is kind of really tight. So I'm just trying to like air it out a little bit and give it some space. So that's really not, it doesn't play too much into the main structure of the song. It's just kind of there as a textural thing. Same thing happens again there. And then this is when the instrumental part is. I have another lead. This is where the panic chords, as Sting calls them, goes. So like here, I didn't gate the noise out on this track, on these tracks. Kind of just one of those little subtle things where I'm not trying to keep this super tight. I'm trying to keep the noise, kind of adds a little bit of a live feel to it. Like, not like saying that's a live thing, a track or anything, but it's like just another little thing to add a little bit of tension and just some, not sloppiness, but like creative sloppiness, if that makes sense. And then I have a lead fade in. This is when the larger lead part comes in. So I have technically 3 leads running at once, but playing different things. So I have this as a lead in, where it's a lo-fi fade in. Play this one. And then the ones hold on for a little bit longer, and the first 2 are a little bit drier. Those 2 are super dry, whereas these 2. So these are actually more leads, like in the context, they're the lead part in this section. And then the only other leads that happen are at the end here, and this is kind of to add tension even more so. It's like super long delay, just kind of strumming notes. Kind of like adds that like horror vibe to it, where it's just notes sustaining and what's building up is the harmonic content, but the harmonic content is being dissonant with each other. And then as it jumps to the end, it's just a dissonant chord being played over and over again in an arpeggio, back and forth in the background, kind of again to add tension a little bit. Oh, this guy got sick. There you go. Cool. I think that's leads. Anybody have any questions about guitars? I'm trying to make this fast. It won't take too much longer, I swear. It's just vocals and then some ambient effects. Just some layers. Cool. I'm going to hop onto vocals real quick. So in the main vocals, we have a lot of vocals, but in this specific project, in terms of mains, there's 3 people on this. It's me, Max Ludwig, if you know who he is, and his roommate, Ben, which nobody knows who Ben is here because he's not a music student. But so versus having one vocalist sing kind of the entire thing through. At first, I asked them to do it, one because they're friends, and at the time, I was kind of losing my voice. But as the end of the project went on, as the mixing of this went on, I got my voice back partway through, so I was able to do it at that point. But yeah, anyway, so jumping through the vocals, if we just solo the vocals up,
I find myself in this pain.
It's like if we jump through,
I find myself in this pain. I find myself in this.
so we kind of have 3 different tone, again, like kind of the layering thing. We kind of have 3 different tones. We have a super low tone, a mid tone, and then a high tone, kind of combining. And then we have a couple effects here and there. Ben does some gnarly growls, and I was very happy about that. But anyway, everything, we're kind of using vocals in this sense, again, sometimes to provide some context for different transitions, but to also, what's the word? To totally also just like change the vibe of things. Like,
All my soul was pure rage, fueled by the seeds of hate.
and the thing specific in like kind of this genre is like you want everything very grid aligned. Like if I zoom in, if I unpack this folder so you guys can see, if I really zoom in, like with a couple exceptions, everything's kind of really on the grid. And again, kind of with the guitars and bass and other stuff, you want everything to be really tight. So the last thing you want is like not very tight vocals or very sloppy vocals over a very tight instrumental. And at first that was kind of a really difficult part. It was editing all of these together so that 3 different people sounded like they were all saying the exact same thing at the exact same time. That definitely took a lot of time, but you have to put the time into it if you want it to sound right in the genre, because there's certain expectations in different genres. Like most people kind of expect this kind of cleanliness and tightness in certain genres. So when it's not there, everybody gets really thrown off and it doesn't sit as well with people. Because the last thing you want to do as a mixing engineer is have something stick out as bad. Because like usually at the end of the day, if it's a good song, it's a good song. But if you do something really weird that sticks out, people are going to notice. That's what they pick up on.
Power, brothers who kneel go.
And then as I tried throughout different pieces, I tried, just so it wasn't like a full wall of sound, I tried to add different things here and there. So like, for example, in this part, Ben's the only one. In this part over here, I'm the only one. Just kind of like to throw off the context of everything, just give somebody a spotlight here and there.
The souls of those you love, brothers who kneel go.
And then like in different accentuating parts at the end. Ooh, delay throws. I could talk about that. So in like a different build up part, like this is the lead up to the build. So I'm doing another thing to add some space is I'm doing what's called a delay throw, where you have your dry spot, but you're giving a separate track and allowing delay to kind of sit around for a little bit. Oh, I sent this to a delay bus. So like, for example, it's super wet, but it cuts off really quick just to like add some impact and then get out of the way really fast. Just like kind of fill out the space for a little bit. There's another one over there for a little bit. And an even longer one over there. Because that's after the pre-breakdown section. then there's just a build up. It's just me on the build up, and then at the end, jumping from the leads to the BGs, we got like 6 or 7 layers going on here in the backgrounds. So for the most part, it's just him. If I solo the BGs too. It's like a full stereo spread with a good bit of delay and reverb to kind of like draw out that little bit even more. But yeah, and then in terms of effects or processing, for most of the vocals, I did the same thing where I had the CLA 76. It's just a basic, it's just a really nice compressor. It's not basic, it's anything but basic. Basic in terms of controls, but really up there in terms of functions. So just some compression and then a little bit of EQ just to like kind of shape everybody into the spots, and then some de-essers, because with this type of vocal, especially on a condenser, you get a lot more sibilance and high-end content than you do usually with something else. Usually in this style of music, you're usually using something like an SM7B, like a really responsive dynamic mic, because with this type of vocal, you're getting a lot of wind force and a lot of movement. So you have to kind of counteract that with a little bit, and a compressor doesn't exactly react well to some of this. And then the only other thing I did some more parallel processing. So as you can see, there's no effects on this track. What I'm using is a dirty track. So I'm using this plugin called the Sound Toys Little Altar Boy. They make a lot of great stuff. And what I'm doing is I'm sending all the vocals to this track, but it's pretty maxed out in the drive. I could max it even more, but where it's like really dirty, it's really hard to discern, but I'm blending it in with the clean. So if I solo the main Vox and then blend this guy, if I mute this guy in and out.
I was told, like a slave, to believe what they say.
It's a little hard. This one's a little bit easier to hear, but what you're doing is you're kind of accentuating, like when somebody sings sing is a very generous word, but when someone does it like this, your voice is technically like distorting, like you're distorting your vocal cords is kind of what that is. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of just like taking this and accentuating it a little bit more, just kind of pushing it past, like putting it to a new extreme, but your ears don't really notice too much of a difference unless I take it out. But just another little thing to like tickle your ears and put it a little bit farther up. And then besides the gang vocals just happened at the end, which I've already played. And then the only other thing that happens here is during the chorus, where I put in just a little bit of a panning effect.
The devil of life, the devil of greed.
It's like a lot of effects going on. That's just my filtering. Can't remember if I rendered these already. No, I did not. So what I'm using is another Sound Toys. I'm using Microshift, which what this is doing is this is essentially shifting the pitch of whatever you put this on by a couple cents, just so you're giving it a little bit more, not dissonant, it's almost dissonance, but it's like tasteful dissonance, if that makes sense. It's like if I solo one of these.
The devil of life, the devil of greed. Sacrifice. The devil of life, the devil of greed.
It doesn't sound too different. And then if I give it a couple octaves, I think one of these is pitched up. Yeah, one of these is pitched down a 4th, and then the other one is pitched down an 8th. It's like really weird intervals, but like.
The devil of life, the devil of greed. Sacrifices.
But I kind of wanted them to blend together that way. It was a little unorthodox, but it kind of worked. Like if I paired just the first.
The devil of life, the devil of greed.
Like it's not quite an octave, but it's almost there to the point where it's like off enough that, again, that same sensation of like tickling your ears a little bit on the edges, just to like perk up and be like, oh, something's there. What am I hearing? But yeah, anyway, again, if I'm going too fast, please stop me. But I think that's just for vocals. And then just jumping through ambience real quick. I have a couple hits. There's a lot of ambient layers. Again, the thing with the genre is just layering everything. It's like in the intro, I have a couple digital effects. It's like I have some reversed vocals going on, plus like a little pad synth thing going on. in the intro that slowly gets more and more saturated as you go. Then as we go farther on, I have a couple like rhythmic layers. So like in the chorus, I have a couple things going on. So like I have these pong drums going on, which is like just a beat bouncing back and forth. Almost like a trap beat playing in the background of a metal song. I have a shaker playing. What else is going on here? I have this synth just playing in the background, just like add some depth. You don't really know it's there with these ambient effects. But it's kind of more of like what you feel. So like I put like these guys here just to like kind of accentuate like just like a bopping feel to the section, which is a little weird, but it like kind of worked. Which, did I definitely go a little overkill with some of my layers? Definitely. One thing to do with when you're adding ambient layers is do the mute test. Is if you play it in the full context of the mix, you mute it and unmute it, you don't hear any difference, then just trash it. Just get rid of it, because it's very easy to go overboard with your ambient layers. And then a couple other things. I have this guy. Oh, yeah. Memphis and Gavin will know what this is. This is, we got the Line 6 amp in the studio to kind of make this weird noise between two different channels. I was actually able to use this sample in the thing. This is not what it sounded like originally. I stretched it out a good bit and did a couple different things to it. I think I rendered the effects. Yeah, I rendered the effects in this session. I did it somewhere else. But it's fun when you get to use stuff that you've captured and then just kind of mess with it in your own way versus like getting samples that somebody else has messed with. And then just another like phasing sample going on in the background. And then chorus is the repeat of the usual section. And then during the lead buildup, just this playing in the background, and then right before the slower breakdown and stuff, this is just kind of building up. I didn't want too much tension. This is just kind of there just to add a little bit of tension right before I want the actual tension, and then it just pitch shifts up at the end. And then right here, there's a couple different things. There's an FX hit, or part of one. More electronic samples. Just some more noises going on. And then kind of on top of that, there's also some hits. Those are gated cymbal. Nothing crazy. There's a reverse snare going on right before that one hit. Just kind of little things to accentuate what's already there. And then right before the breakdown, I add this FX hit again, but it's longer. It's actually the full hit. Again, just kind of building that tension. And then just a full sub drop. It's like a really long sub drop. Just kind of builds up that energy. But as a sub drop, it's kind of a release of energy. And then there's one right at the breakdown, which is a little bit shorter, just so it doesn't take up too much space. And then in the background, you can kind of hear this panic sample just going. So I played the sample from earlier, but it's a lot slower. Just again, since the section's slower, and also just to kind of increase the tension that's there. This guy's back there too. Yeah, cool. I'm sorry if I rambled too much. I think that's most of what I would say I would talk about for something genre specific like this. Anybody have any questions?
How long did all this take you?
Very long, too long. And I think that was also just mainly due to, how would I explain? A lot of this was just due to just me, because this being my first song, like definitely because I didn't know what to expect, so I kind of just like went at it, not knowing what I was doing, pretty much. Well, partially knowing what I was doing, but like not at the same time. So it definitely took a lot longer than it needed to, for multiple reasons here and there. But yeah, it definitely took a long time. Anything else? Any bus questions? I haven't talked about the buses at all, but I won't bore you guys with that. That definitely gets really specific. Cool. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we're good.